This is the audio lecture for Chapter 9 from the Nye Text Technology Matters. The title of Chapter 9 is More Security or Escalating Dangers. Nye is returning with the title of this chapter to giving us sort of a binary choice or a choice between one thing or another. And here he's suggesting that technology can offer us more security than we have now, or technology can offer us more dangers than we have now. And throughout Chapter 9, he will talk about whether or not and to what extent technology provides each of these things for us. So, the core idea or the core concept around which Chapter 9 is based is the relationship between technology and either security or danger, depending on which of these things technology provides for us and to what degree technology provides these things for us or to us. Uh, in this lecture, introducing Chapter 9, I am going to talk about three different main sections. The first one is regarding how technology is involved with accidents of different kinds, as well as the return of the concept of unintended consequences, which we have encountered, of course, in Nye before Chapter 9, and which returns in this chapter as he talks about um, the issue of technology and the dangers posed by it. The heart of the chapter and the bulk of the material in the chapter is about technology and warfare. Nye talks about a number of things using, as he usually does, a historical framework in talking about the ways in which warfare has evolved over the centuries in terms of technology. And then finally, at the very end of the chapter, Nye talks about a little bit about how the issue of warfare has sort of morphed or transitioned into, at least in the United States, an issue of security in terms of technology and security and its relationship to terrorism, which, of course, in the United States has been one of our main concerns in relationship to warfare and so forth in the last 10 or 12 years or so. So Nye begins by devoting the first section of the chapter to uh, the ways in which technology has caused accidents and other things related to unintended consequences. Now, you'll remember the concept of unintended consequences we encountered in one or two chapters earlier in the Nye text. And this is simply the idea that oftentimes, whatever the purpose of a particular technology is, or a particular technological object or a technological system, whatever the purpose or intent of that technology is, there oftentimes will be consequences or results from that technology that its makers or its inventors did not intend. And oftentimes, those consequences are consequences that are very uh, harmful. They have an adverse effect on either society in general or on particular individuals. And one of the first ideas that Nye talks about in this respect, sort of leading into this whole bigger idea of accidents and unintended consequences, is that throughout history, in many different societies, governments have legitimized themselves through the infrastructure that they have devoted themselves to developing. That term infrastructure, you should recognize or remember from a couple of chapters back when we talked about landscape. Infrastructure is one of the key concepts related to landscape. And infrastructure basically is sort of the support network of roads, of utilities of different kind, power and water utilities, um, communication networks such as the internet and telephone systems, All of these sorts of things can be considered infrastructure. And so over history, governments have sort of made the case for their own validity and their own um, legitimacy through um, trying to make the case that it is only through a centralized control of government that infrastructure of different kinds, such as highway systems, for example, here in the United States, are going to be able to get built and maintained and so forth. And one of the historical examples that Nye gives of this is the Great Wall of China, which is, of course, a very ancient piece of infrastructure dating back centuries. And that's one of the earliest examples, or an early example, that he gives of how a government, in this case the centralized government of ancient China, created a massive infrastructure project in the form of the Great Wall of China. In this section of the chapter, Nye also talks about how oftentimes when technology is applied to try to solve problems of different kinds, in relation especially to the natural world or natural issues, natural calamities, and so forth, what that technology ends up doing is creating worse problems or worsening the problem that it was meant to help solve than what the situation was to begin with. And there are several different examples that he gives of this. Um, Two of the most significant and substantive are related to the chemical DDT and then also to forest fires. In regards to DDT, this is a chemical that, starting in the 1950s or 1960s, was developed and was used to try to eradicate mosquitoes in different areas. And what ended up happening was that the mosquitoes simply became, over time, resistant to this particular chemical, and it was no longer effective in trying to eradicate them. And in addition to that, it was discovered that DDT was very harmful to humans, and that the spraying of DDT to try and get rid of mosquitoes was causing a great many health problems for a great many different people. The other major example that he gives is of forest fires. Technology has advanced to a place where we're very good, we've become very good at preventing forest fires. But what happens with that is that because forest fires are prevented and forest fires do not occur with the same kind of regularity as they would if just in nature without human intervention, a lot of combustible material in the form of underbrush and foliage of different kinds grows up in the forest. And then, when there does happen to be a forest fire, it ends up being much more combustible and spreads much more quickly because there is all of this underbrush that ignites and burns and spreads the fire very quickly. Whereas if forest fires were allowed to just happen naturally the way that they did for eons before humans were around, or before we had the technology to control it, that would clear out that underbrush, and forest fires would maybe still be bad, but not as bad as they sometimes are now that we are supposedly preventing them. The other thing, or the last thing I'm going to talk about here that Nye talks about in this first section of chapter 9 is a paradox, what I'm labeling here as the paradox of technology, what he in the chapter calls the paradoxical effects that advanced technologies have created in human society today. This is the idea that individual machines are safer, So, any individual technological object or machine is safer than it ever has been. But in general, technology has become far more complex and far more unforeseeable in terms of what the possible effects or the possible dangers of technology as a whole are going to be. And so this, Nye proposes, creates a paradox that is a very interesting one for human society at this particular point in history. And uh, if you don't know what the definition of the word paradox is, you should look that up and see how this description of individual machines being safer, but technology in general being perhaps less safe, fits the definition of a paradox. So the heart of chapter 9, as I said, is treating the issue of technology and warfare. Nye follows a sort of a historical progression in talking about the development of different sorts of weapons, the developments, historical developments in technology as it relates to warfare. The beginning of this section, he makes the point, though, that of course the first thing and the main thing that we think about and that is, actually involved in technology when we're talking about technology and warfare is weaponry. The development of weapons, the refinement of weapons, and the invention and creation and innovations related to weapons used to wage war. Of course, this goes way back all the way to the first stone arrowheads that humans made, all the way up to you know nuclear weapons and other things that we have got in today and in recent years. But one of the points that Nye makes is that in addition to weaponry, uh, technology's relationship to warfare also includes first defensive technology, which we might expect, but then also things like medical technology, the technology involved in creating supplies or getting supplies to and transporting soldiers, and also communication technology. So, warfare, just as much as it's been affected by the development and the technological progress in weaponry, has also been affected by technological developments in, for instance, forms of transportation. Not just tanks and that sort of thing, but you know, um, trains, uh, trucks of different kinds, certainly airplanes have played a big role in the development of warfare. And medicine and communication are two particular areas that Nye argues where the improvements that have made, the technological improvements, can be really crucial. Medicine, for instance, the more that medical technology has progressed, the better that doctors and nurses have been able to help wounded soldiers in wartime, uh, the more that the people controlling armed forces, such as national leaders and generals and so forth, have taken advantage of the ability to put troops and soldiers and so forth more into harm's way because they know that medical technology has advanced to the point where um, more injuries are able to be survived and sustained and so forth. And then, of course, communication as well. The better the communication has gotten between the front lines and the command and so forth, the bigger differences that has made on the waging of war over the course of the centuries. There is, of course, a symmetry that either exists or doesn't exist, or exists to different degrees between the two sides in any particular armed conflict or war. And there have been many examples that Nye talks about where this balance has been asymmetrical. Now, I don't believe uses the terms asymmetrical and symmetrical in the way I'm doing here, but it's basically the idea that he's talking about. With asymmetrical, meaning that one side has got vastly better technology than the other side, better weapons, better technology of all the different kinds that I've been talking about here in regards to warfare. And this has allowed some nations or some armed forces to dominate other people, dominate their opponents. And this has been the case, as Nye notes, in a variety of different um, conflicts related to colonialism. In the 1700s, 1800s, into the 1900s. Um, Mostly European powers, such as Britain and France and Germany and so forth, were able to go into what became colonial areas in Asia and in Africa and South America, and basically just sort of march right in and take them over because of the asymmetry in the war making technology that existed between the two sides. There also have been some instances, of course, in history where the two sides in a armed conflict had symmetrical um, situations in which they had basically equal technologies. They had the same technologies and in equal amounts. And that has caused situations in history where basically there was a stalemate involved. This was the case, for example, with World War One. By the early years of the 20th century, at least amongst the European powers, pretty much all of the European powers had pretty much gained an equal footing with one another when it comes to the war making technology that existed at that time. And that had quite an effect on the early years of World War One. The story of how this technology and this sort of symmetrical balance between the sides in World War One really forms sort of the core of the information that Nye is giving in relation to technology and warfare. And so I wanted to devote a little bit more attention just to providing you with the details or maybe reminding you of what the historical details and context was in regards to World War One. So World War One, the entire war took place between 1914 and 1918, so just a little bit under 100 years ago now. It started in 1914 in Europe, but the United States did not become involved in World War One until almost the end of the war. In 1917, the war had been going for nearly 3 years by the time the United States became involved in 1917. World War One was at the time and for a long time afterwards, at least until the beginning of World War Two, was considered to be a very brutal and destructive war. Was referred to, I think, while it was still going on, and in the years then after the end of World War One and before World War Two started, it was referred to as the Great War. This was, of course, before World War II had taken place, and so they did not call it World War I at that time because they didn't know there was going to be another World War. And so they simply referred to it as the Great War, and in some contexts referred to it as the war to end all wars because it was such a brutal and destructive conflict in Europe that it gained these nicknames. If nickname is the right word to use for an alternate name for a war. And as I had already said, very shortly after the war, within a year after the war started in 1914, the fighting between the two sides, the Allied powers and the Central powers, settled into a stalemate where neither side had the advantage. They just kind of were fighting against each other without either side gaining any kind of advantage and settling into what was called trench warfare. This is where the two sides dug trenches into the ground, and mostly this was in an area kind of along the Belgian, French, German border in northwest Europe, uh, and along through there they dug trenches, and each side had their trenches. Between the trenches was what was called no man's land with barbed wire and other things. And sometimes one side or the other would storm out of their trenches and make an advance and gain a little bit of ground. But mostly it was a stalemate for several years. It was with the U.S. entry in 1917 that the tide sort of turned in World War I, and the Allied powers, which included France and England and all of the British Commonwealth nations, such as Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, defeated the Central Powers, which consisted of Germany, of Austria Hungary, which at that time the two were combined into a single nation. And then finally, the other member of the Central Powers, or the other main member of the Central Powers, was the Ottoman Empire. Now, this is an empire, a nation that existed for quite a while, more than a century, I think, before World War I, and consisted mainly of what is now the country of Turkey and some other areas in the Middle East, and spreading eastward from there, going all the way over to I think the border of China and India in Central Asia. So the U.S. entry in 1917 helped to turn the tide, and eventually the Allied powers did win the war then against the Central Powers in 1918. So, in the years since World War II, there's been a number of additional developments in warfare related to technology and in war making technology. One of these that started in the years between World War I and World War II was the maturation of air power as a way of waging war. Airplanes were involved in World War I to some extent. Biplanes with the two sort of levels of wings. The Red Baron was part of World War I. But at the time, in the 19 teens, air flight had only been around for about 10 or 15 years. And so it wasn't very advanced, but in the 20 years between the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II, airplanes and air power became much more advanced, and so it played a much more prominent role in the combat in World War II. One of the ways that it did that was at the very end of World War II, when the U.S. defeated Japan, was through airplanes dropping atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. And that was the next stage of the development of warfare technology or war making technology. And that continued through most of the rest of the 20th century. The United States and the Soviet Union developed a variety of different kinds of nuclear weapons in the 1950s. Atom bombs rather quickly gave way to hydrogen bombs, and then a variety of different sorts of nuclear weapons and a variety of different sorts of forms of nuclear weapons, with missiles becoming the most common. And one of the things that happened in these years, which formed the Cold War, which started just very shortly, within a few years after the end of World War II in the late 1940s, and lasted all the way until basically the end of the 1980s, was that the buildup of nuclear weapons by the United States and the Soviet Union resulted in a situation that was given the name Mutual Assured Destruction, which sort of felicitously has the abbreviations MAD, M-A-D. What Mutual Assured Destruction was the idea that both sides had such vast amounts of nuclear weapons that if either of the sides launched a nuclear attack on the other side, that the other side would retaliate and create just as much destruction on the initial attacking side as the attacker did. So a launch of nuclear weapons or a use of nuclear weapons by either side would result in the complete destruction of both sides in a way that hadn't been the case in conventional warfare in human history up until then. And so Nye talks a little bit about this phenomenon of mutual assured destruction. He also talks a little bit about the concept of the military industrial complex. In the early decades of the Cold War, in the 1950s and 60s, with right at the end of the Eisenhower presidency in 1961 being the key point, the military, what was called the military industrial complex, was emerging and growing. Now, the term was coined by President Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1961 in his farewell speech to the nation when he was leaving office as president in early 1961, and he warned against the military industrial complex. Eisenhower, of course, had a great deal of credibility as somebody to speak about military issues, since he had been the leader of the Allied forces, the general leading all of the Allied forces in World War II, and had been a war hero. And that experience and reputation was what carried him into the White House in 1952. What the military industrial complex is the idea that the creation of weapons became an industry. And as such, there were a great many companies and a great many employees in those companies and so forth that came to rely on the ongoing manufacture of military weapons, the ongoing need for military weapons, which sort of extended itself then into an ongoing need for military conflict in the United States or by the United States, and into an ongoing need for the justification for creating weapon systems and building up our defense and so forth. And then one of the final points that Nye makes in this section of chapter 9 is that um, there have been many instances in history where the country that has the superior war-making technology does not necessarily win. That having superior war-making technology does not ensure victory. There's a great many cases, the Vietnam War and that the United States was involved in, just being probably the most recent or a more recent one, in which the country with the superior war-making technology does not win the war. That there are a great many things uh, that that nations or groups of people can do to try and resist the countries that have the superior war-making technology. In very recent years, in the last 10 or 12 years, we have seen the bulk of our concerns and activity when it comes to warfare turning to the response to terrorism. And the phenomenon of terrorism, I'm not sure if Nye says this directly, but the phenomenon of terrorism is one way that overmatched peoples or groups can fight back against an opponent that has superior technology. And so, in more recent years, in the past 10 or 12 years, uh, our concerns have turned a little bit away from technology and warfare per se, and towards technology and security right here at home in the United States. And part of this has involved much higher degree of in America, again, this is a much higher degree of civilian vulnerability to terrorism and to acts of war. Of course, the 9/11 attacks, in which the World Trade Center towers were brought down, was the most dramatic example of that. But the sort of biological warfare that followed immediately in the wake of 9/11 was another example of that, in which um, biological agents in the form of anthrax spores were sent through the mail, and there was a great scare that fall regarding that sort of thing, and the vulnerability of the general populace to these sorts of acts. So Nye sort of elaborates a little bit of a explanation of what terrorism is vis-a-vis or in relation to technology. And the gist of this is that terrorism is a strategy that uses a mix of technology, some higher forms of technology, but many low forms of technology or low tech methods, in which a group fights against a technologically superior opponent. And oftentimes, the people who are utilizing terrorism are helped by the complexity of the opponent's technology. I'll give you just a couple of examples related again to the September 11th attacks to hopefully make this a little clearer. Um, the 9/11 attackers utilized jet airplanes, which is a very complex form of technology. They were able to exploit the complexity of that technology of jet airplanes uh, by hijacking the planes and then utilizing the planes basically as missiles to ram into the World Trade Center towers. And so that is one way in which the terrorists were able to take advantage of or exploit the complexity of that technology. And one additional way that they used a low tech method to accomplish that was the individual terrorists on the four planes that were hijacked used box cutters to take over the planes, which is a very low tech method that they were able to use in order to gain control of those planes. So, terrorism utilizes a mix of different levels of technology to fight against a technologically superior opponent, and sometimes also exploiting the complexity of technology and sort of turning it against the people that the terrorists are trying to fight. And this is basically where Nye ends chapter 9 with this shift that has taken place over the past dozen years or so from concern with technology and warfare to more of a concern with technology and security here at home.